So today I'm back with new science fiction fantasy reviews. These are all 2023 releases that are just coming out, and many of these books are by authors that I have read and loved before, so I have been anticipating these books quite a bit, and I suspect at least a few of these books have been on your tentative TBR, so hopefully I can decide which ones are worth your time and money. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's start with science fiction, starting with The Archive Undying by Mieko Candon. This is a book that I received for review from the publisher. And at the beginning of the story, the basic premise is that it starts out with this robotic god that goes crazy and destroys everything around it, including the city where it normally stays host. And they destroy everything except in the case of this young individual who is in this otherly state. They are not dead, but they're not really alive. They are described as being a ghost in a way, and within the story, they wake up after this one-night stand to find themselves more alive. This is such a hard book to summarize because it's very strange. While I would classify this as science fiction, it definitely has elements of fantasy within it, so keep that in mind. And within the story, it is very large in scope of what the author is trying to do in terms of the world building, but is told in a very narrow perspective. We essentially get the entire book from the perspective of this young gay man. And so that is perhaps one of my setbacks with this book, is the fact that the world building in terms of the imagination of the author is incredible, and we only get to see a slice of that in this book, but it is the first book in a series, and I suspect that that information will grow and grow with each book. The world building in this one in a way reminds me of that of Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is again a book where the world building is very interesting, but it's described in a way that takes a long time to get passed along to the reader. The author just doesn't lay it all out for us. Instead, we kind of get little pieces of information, which is how I felt here. It's funny that I made a comparison to Black Sun because I ended up switching for part of this book to the audio, which turned out to have one of the same narrators as Black Sun. So I suspect I'm not the only one in the book sphere who realized that these books had a bit of connection, even though that one is fantasy and this one is predominantly science fiction. In terms of the story, there is a heavy emphasis on the relationship between this man and his lover, and normally that would be a drawback within my reading, but in this case, I'll be honest, I got really pulled into it. I love their interactions. In general, this book is just very relationship heavy, very character focused, and again, it's a very intimate story told within this sweeping world. So if you're someone who wants to know all the large ideas behind this book, you're not going to get that. But if you want a very immersive, engrossing story, this is exactly what this is. I was completely hooked into this book and did not want to stop reading it. I am absolutely here for book 2, despite my small quibbles that I think the world building could have been punched up. I wanted more. Again, that's a good thing that it's the first book in a series, and so I'm hoping that the author will satisfy me in later books. The writing is very beautiful. I really enjoyed the cadence of the narration when I did the audio, and easily on the page there were parts that I wanted to highlight, which I never do when I read, and just really enjoyed that. I do want to mention that the dialogue itself is a little bit more casual than I normally prefer. Often, again, some of the things that this author does are things that normally would be criticisms of a new release, but for whatever reason, the book just worked for me, and I don't think it's perfect, but it's a really engaging story, and I definitely want more. Next, let's talk about Translation State by Ann Leckie, and this is a standalone book that is set in the same world as her Imperial Radish trilogy, and so the first book in there is Ancillary Justice. And while it's set in the same world, you could definitely read this as a standalone. You don't need to know the other books, and in fact, I would say that the connections are very weak. So as someone who has read the entire original trilogy, I didn't get a lot of connections there other than the fact that the marketers told me it was set in the same world. In this story, we follow an individual who is a translator but reluctant for their job, and so they end up teaming up with some other misfits. There is a reluctant diplomat and then a mechanic, and they all come together. And so this very much is a ragtag space opera story, and it's very cute and cozy, which is what I've come to expect with Ann Leckie's work. If you've read the original Imperial Radish trilogy, you'll know that the first book is actually quite cutting with a strong revenge plot, but then the later 2 books have a giant shift in tone, which I've recently talked about. And so if you love the following books, Ancillary Sword and Ancillary Mercy, and love the fact that it's really cute and quaint, and there's a lot of discussion about what the characters are eating and drinking, You will enjoy this one as well. I think it is most closely resembling those. I should mention that I haven't read their other book, Providence, so I can't compare this one to that. But I did find this book to be overall really good. If I had a complaint, it's just the fact that I wanted this to be darker and things that Ann Leckie's work is not. I wish it was a little bit more plot heavy instead of being cutesy, just because that's not my preference. But for what it was doing, it was really well done and I did enjoy reading it. Next, let's talk about Lords of Uncreation by Adrian Tchaikovsky, another book that I've received for review. And this is the third and final book in the space opera trilogy that starts with Shards of Earth. And I'm of course going to talk about this in a spoiler-free way for those of you that haven't started the books yet. In the first book, we follow a far-flung future where you have humanity on the run because there are these ancient aliens that have shown up and proceed to turn Earth into a piece of architecture. And so humanity runs off to other colonies and these architects follow them and proceed to do the same thing over and over again. Understandably, the colonies of humanity have to deal with this, and so they group together and the story transpires from there. I really love the first book. It's one of my favorite debut space operas. I really enjoyed book one and I liked book two as well. And so my feelings about this one are very similar to how I felt about book two, where I love the ideas explored in this book. I love a lot of what they're doing on a larger scale. So if you want the world building that was perhaps a little bit lacking in scope in terms of Archive Undying, you'll be pleased with what you're getting here. But for me, I continue to not be invested in the characters, which makes it hard to read such a long book where I'm just not fully immersed in the story. I thought that the ending was solid and fit the story, but I just wasn't as attached to it. I love the start of the story so much more than the ending. And not to say that the ending let me down, I just wasn't fully pulled through the entire story, or rather that the story itself didn't keep me fully engaged the way I want to, which is often my experience with series where I love the first book, I like the second, and my feelings towards it kind of dampens as I go on and on. So it might be a case of the reader that's the problem, not the book, but that's my opinion here. I also read The Deep by River Solomon. This is a speculative fiction novella that follows this race of mermaids, and specifically we follow one that holds the memories of their culture, and so they are required to relive the trauma of their people's past. This book, while fictionalized, draws from real life historical events where the black slaves, when they were taken across the Atlantic Ocean, if they were sick or for whatever reason they did not comply, they would be thrown overboard and killed. And so the story reimagines what if they didn't die but instead turned into mermaids. And so you have this individual within the culture that holds the memory of this horrible, horrible past, and they hold the memory so that the rest of the mermaids can live in some kind of peace. So in a lot of ways, I would describe this book as The Little Mermaid meets the classic children's book, The Giver, but I kind of feel like that description sells the book short because this is a really important story. It was not a fun story to read, but often those, once again, are the most important ones. I found it to be very topical. It's a very short book. I mentioned it's more novella length, and it was very entrancing. One thing you may want to consider is if you are an audiobook listener, you may want to try doing it that way because of the fact that there is a cadence or a narrative rhyme to the story that you really hear when it is spoken out loud. So I thought that that really added to the experience because hopefully I'm not saying this wrong, but I believe the author collaborated with a well-known rapper who really helped to bring the prose to life. So I thought it was quite the important experience to have, but I will be fully honest, it's an experience I don't plan to revisit very soon because it wasn't an easy read and I'm still digesting it just from my first time. Let's switch gears and talk about fantasy, starting with The Sword Defiant. This is the first book in a new epic fantasy series. In the story, we have a backstory where the main character, along with 9 of their companions, were responsible for saving the world from this evil lord. Now they have to come together once again in the present day because there's a new threat, and so they have to come together as a group. They have to deal with a sword, and the story goes from there. This is a book I did as a buddy read with another friend who had a review copy, and he made a really apt comparison, which I definitely want to steal here, and that's the fact that this book felt very classic in nature. Specifically, it reminded him, and then also me, of the Lord of the Rings books. And so if you love something in that vein, obviously that's a really high comparison to make, but it's definitely done a similar style where you have a group of individuals who are going along, they have a quest to complete, they gather together as a fellowship or a group, and there is an object that is the center of the story. In that case, it's a ring, here is a sword, and so forth. And that is both my compliment and criticism of this book. It's the fact that I have read stories like this before. I've said so many times that I really get excited about a fantasy book that does something I haven't read or seen in the past. And this one was a touch predictable, but it was still very well done for what it was doing. Definitely it has nods to D&D if you love that franchise. And it was very well done in terms of the character work, the world building, the engaging plot. I do think he has really nice prose. For me, I read this book after checking out the author's backlist, The Gutter Prayer, which I thought was such a unique and interesting story that I was a little bit disappointed that the author leaned back into playing it safe and going back to more of the tropey roots of the genre when I know they're capable of doing something really innovative like that one. So I personally would recommend this one more, but if you are someone who has a preference for a more traditional fantasy narrative, you might enjoy this one even a touch more than I did. And again, I thought it was very well done. I still gave it 4 stars, but I wanted to absolutely love it, and I thought it was a little bit safe is the word I keep wanting to use. Next, let's talk about The Witch King by Martha Wells, which is a new release, another book I received from the publisher for review. And this is a story that follows a person who, right at the beginning of the story, they die and their consciousness is trapped. And so they wake up finding this person who's trying to steal their magic from them, and the story goes from there. In terms of a premise, I was so excited for this one. It definitely sounded like it might have some necromancy or just a darkness to it. And it sounded incredibly innovative and creative, which, for those of you who don't know, this author, of course, also wrote Murderbot, the sci-fi novellas that so many of us enjoy. And so because of the fact that this author has this history of writing really kooky, out-of-the-box stories, I was very excited for this new release to see what they would do going back to fantasy, because I know they've written fantasy prior to the Murderbots. And so I expected their backlist fantasy to be more traditional, but I was hoping that this one would really stand out. And despite the fact that it has an incredibly cool and unusual premise I've never read before, I was very surprised that this book felt very traditional. Don't get me wrong, I haven't read a book that specifically deals with some of these time travel and different elements that you see in the story, but despite how out of the box it sounds from what I'm describing, it felt very classic. I felt like the author was still writing inside the box, they just moved the box slightly over to the left so that it sounded new, but it felt safe. So I do want to acknowledge once again, I do think Martha Wells is also another good writer, so I was still engaged in the story. I thought the characters were interesting, but this is not my favorite of her work. I really was hoping for something more innovative given the fact that she's writing again in 2023 with something new. And the story felt tired, which is really disappointing. And I liked it, but I didn't love it as much as I hoped. I also want to mention that I finally finished Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin. This is a chunky fantasy story that gives the backstory to the rise of the Targaryens. At the time of recording this, I still have not gotten a chance to watch the House of Dragons TV show, but I really want to. I love the original series, even though it'll never get finished. I do want to do a reread. I'm hoping to do that either at Christmas or early next year. So if anyone wants to join me, let me know. But this was one that's been on my bucket list for a while. I love the beginning of the story, the setup of how the Targaryens came to be, and a lot of the foundations of this great house were fantastic to read about. But this book is really long. My copy is almost 800 pages, and I fully admit that I found the middle of the book especially to be a slog. It reads like a history book, a really interesting history book, but still a history book, and it's a long one to get through. So for someone who typically loves to fly through books and move on to other ones, I found I was reading this one for a really long time, and I was ready to move on before the book was done, which isn't the best sign. I still really enjoyed this one. My copy has beautiful illustrations, which is really fun to read, and again, just got me excited about the Fire and Blood universe once again. So if you have not read this book, I would only recommend it to diehard fans of A Game of Thrones, a TV show, and the book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, because I don't recommend starting here. It's definitely an add-on, not a starting place. And finally, I read Queen of the Conquered by Kacen Callender, and this is an epic fantasy that is inspired by Caribbean culture. In the story, we follow a young woman who is the daughter of the queen and is moved into the queen position when her nation is taken over by another faction. And instead of killing her or making her a slave, they leave her in their position in order for this person, this young woman, to serve as almost a collaborator for their takeover and legitimize it. Now, from my basic understanding of human history, I think that unfortunately situations like this have been very common throughout the years, where someone is placed in a position to be a puppet to help legitimize a government that has taken over. And so in terms of story, I thought it was very interesting in terms of like the political maneuvering. The story itself, as you can imagine, is very brutal. Terrible things are happening to this woman's citizens, and she's in a position where she can't do anything, which is horribly frustrating. But because of that, I found this book to be a little bit frustrating, because one of my least favorite tropes or positions of stories is when you have a character, specifically a female character, who's in a position where they can't do anything because they lose all their autonomy. It makes sense within the focus of the story, so I can't really fault it there, but it didn't make for the most enjoyable read. That being said, I am interested in reading the second part of what I believe is this duology, because there definitely was a turning point at the end of the story, which I think is going to make the second book a lot more interesting. So I like this one, but I didn't love it quite as much as I hoped to, but I'm hoping that the end of the book will turn that around and make this a series that I really love. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And also drop me a note. What is a new release coming out that you would really like me to read and review for you? I would love to know which books you want me to prioritize. I'll do my best if I can get a review copy in a reasonable time. And if you're new to my channel and want to subscribe, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a spaceship or a sword. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.